welcome to another booktube video from me, Lauren, from Lauren and the Books. I hope you're all having a lovely Thursday. Can you believe it's the end of March already? It is. It's April at the weekend, and this video is me talking about the books that I've read in March. So I read 8 books in March, DNF'ed 1, and I'm going to talk about all of those here now. Now, I'm filming this when it's not quite the end of March. It's the 29th. It's almost the end of March. I don't think I'm going to finish anything else before the end of the month. I've got a few busy days ahead of me and a cozy read night. It's cozy read night tomorrow, on the day you're watching this, by the way. So I think this is it for the March reading. We'll start with the stats, as we always do. So I read 8 books this month and 1 DNF, which means that I've read 31 books in total this year. That I read 2 books from my March TBR, which meant I read 11% of my March TBR, not that great. And this month's reading was 3 books that I owned, which is 38% of my reading, 2 audiobooks, which is 25% of my reading, 3 books from the library, 38% of my reading, and that's it. That adds up to 8. And that means overall in the year, I've read 31 books, as I said. 14 of those have been books that I've owned, which is 45%. 9 of those have been audiobooks, which is 29%. 7 of those have been library books, which is 23%, and 1 of those has been a borrowed book from my sister, in fact, which was 3%. And I mentioned earlier that I'd read 2 books off my TBR in March. My TBR was 18 books in. Tough for the March TBR because I knew I was taking part in the Irish Readathon, and I knew that the Women's Prize for Fiction was coming out. I didn't predict any of, so I've read a lot from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. I've read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But none of those were on my TBR because I didn't know what the Women's Prize long list was at that point. So yeah, I've read, out of all of my TBRs altogether, there's been 55 books on my TBR so far this year, and I've read 19 of them, which is 35%, which is pretty good going, guys. And then just the hauled books, so I've now hauled 49 books. I've read 4 of those books that I've hauled in book hauls, which is 8% of the books that I've hauled. And then I've hauled 65 library books, and I've read 22% of those. So I've read 10, well, I've read 10 of them, and I've DNF'd 4, which counts towards it because I've tried reading them and not got on with them. So 22% of the books that I've got from the library, I've read or DNF'd. So feeling pretty pleased with that. But on to the actual book. So the first book was an audiobook. It was The Colony by Audrey McGee. This is a book by an Irish author, and it's set on an island off the coast of Ireland, off the coast of Ireland. And the main story is about an English chap going over there, a chap called Lloyd, who's going over to document the lives of these the islanders, and it's an Irish-speaking island, should have also mentioned that, through art. And he gets very involved with one of the young lads on the island and sort of becomes a bit of a tutor to him. That young lad's Irish name is Seamus, but by the end of the book he wants to go by the name James. There's also another chap on the island called JP, who's a French guy who's on there to study their use of the Irish language. Now, that main story of 2 sort of like men coming over who aren't originating from this island and documenting and studying the country, studying the island and wanting the island to be a certain way even though they're not from that island, was really annoying. So that was the main story, and the book itself is interspersed with sort of like murders and deaths that are going on the mainland, as this is set. Well, it doesn't actually give you the time that it's set, but like there's troubles going on. It doesn't give you a specific time. So they're really, really shocking and hard to read, and like particularly ones where it would just be like a man having dinner with his family and someone coming in and shooting him, and stuff. Like, all of them were hard to read, but those ones in particular. So yeah, the storyline itself, I found it annoying because it was these 2 guys who just sort of come over and wanted to make changes or not make changes, or they wanted the island to be a specific way, and really that was nothing to do with them. Yeah, and then those sort of interspersing. I found it fine. Like, maybe I wanted more from like the actual islanders, but yeah, I just found it fine. So that was The Colony by Audrey McGee. Next up is this proof copy of Wandering Souls by Cecile Pinn. This came out this like March, 2nd of March, and this was the first book that I read on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. I missed a lot of the Women's Prize for Fiction hype stuff. My father-in-law fell very ill at the beginning of the month, and I didn't do my reactions video or anything like that, but in case you didn't see any of that before, I got 3 books right on the Women's Prize long list, but I hadn't read one. So I have got 16 books to read by the time the shortlist is announced. It's going quite well. As I said, I've read 6 and I'm halfway through 1 audio book, so I'm halfway through 2 more. So I'm almost halfway through them, so feeling pretty good about them. But this was the first one that I read, Wandering Souls by Cecile Pym. This is set in the, well, it sort of spans some time, but it starts off in the 70s, where a family are preparing for a journey, a perilous journey by boat from Vietnam to the mainland in order to flee the troubles that's happening in Vietnam. And the family split into 2, and on one boat is the older sister and 2 younger brothers, and on another boat is the mum, the dad, and some younger children as well, and only one of those boats makes it to the mainland, and that's the boat with the older sister and the 2 younger brothers. So you're following their journey in a refugee camp and then being rehomed in the UK, which was an experience I haven't read much about when I've read books about this, particularly from Asia as well, like refugees coming over to the UK from somewhere in Asia. And yeah, and then you follow the storyline of them sort of like settling in this flat and getting jobs and going to school, and the sister in this family becoming like more of the mother figure and having to mother these 2 younger lads and the people they come into contact with throughout. But then also you're finding out you've got a perspective from the youngest boy on the boat with the mum and dad who died, so sort of like a ghostly perspective. And then it's also sort of interspersed with like radio bulletins and newspaper clippings of ways that refugees have been treated over the years. And one of the most recent ones that's reported in here is there was a lorry found in Essex in 2019, I think it was, which had like a large number of Chinese migrants on there that had died in this because there was no air in this lorry for them. So like it's really hard hitting and very difficult to read in parts, like really difficult to read in parts, particularly some of the treatment of the people who were trying to escape Vietnam. And I found it very, very difficult, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. I thought the writing style was great, and I loved hearing about the family settling and like the little moments of joy that they would have, and like as they became more and more embedded in their new lives and were able to sort of like make roots and stuff. I really love that. But yeah, a very hard read, but a great, and I'm so pleased it's been longlisted. And yes, we'll see what happens with this. We'll see what happens. I wonder if it will make the shortlist. Next up, another one from the Women's Prize long list is Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. I'm actually surprised this was on the long list because the publication date must have been pushed back, because it says here that this was published in March 2022, which was before the time, so it must have been pushed back. But this is a multi-generational novel told through the women of the North family. We hear from Hazel, Miriam, August and Joan, and they live in the South America, not the South, as in America, the South, not South America, and you hear about their lives. Now this isn't without trigger warnings as well. I feel like this is a whole month of sort of trigger warnings in here for domestic violence and sexual assault and racism and things like that, and their lives are littered with these awful things, but there's still, she's just breathed in a hair, a bit of fluff or something, Minnie's fluff. But I loved hearing from the different voices of these, and it starts with a family tree, and I love a book that starts with a family tree. I'm reading a book about the Archers at the moment, and I'm absolutely searching family trees constantly. So this is the North family. So we hear from Hazel, who's like the grandmother of the people that are in the, so Hazel is the beginning of this. Then we also hear from Miriam and August, who are her daughters, and then we also hear from Joan, who is Miriam's daughter. And yeah, I really, really loved it. I loved the voices, and although they were different and had different, because they were from different times. So for example, you'd be hearing about when Hazel met her husband Myron in 40s, I think it was. Yeah, the early 40s. And then you've got Miriam's perspective, who's Hazel's daughter, and then you're hearing from Joan, who was born in 1985, so more of my sort of age, and her life. And as a child, you're hearing from her as a child perspective. But all of the voices, although different, they sounded similar because they're from the same family. And I feel like that's a real hard balance to get. We'll get onto a book later on where there was 4 voices in there and they literally all could have been the same person. But I really appreciated that they all sounded different but similar because they're from the same family. And yeah, it was just packed full of sort of like I said, like a lot of trigger warnings in here, but also love, the love in that family and the support for the women that had towards each other. I really, really loved. So yeah, I found it really, really strong. Love this front cover as well. So there we go. So another great book read from the Women's Prize Fiction. Then not such a great book, not from the Women's Prize long list. I DNF'd this next book. That's The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. I got this out from the library, but I've already taken it back. It's a shame because I really wanted to like this book. It was a book that we were reading for my book club that I do with some friends on Facebook. And that book club, where I used to run it, we now take it in turns to pick the book and do the questions. And I hadn't read the last book because of something else. I can't remember what had happened. But I DNF'd this one as well. And I feel bad when I'm DNFing books that have been put forward for book clubs but picked by other people. But sometimes that does just happen. And for this, like, I just felt so confused by the whole thing. I think it was a time travel novel. I found it really, really hard to care about any of the characters. And there were some awful things happening to these characters as well. So I knew that, like, me not caring meant I wasn't connected enough. And I just felt a bit left out of the whole thing. I didn't feel like it was very well explained. And I was surprised because I saw, it was either this book or another book appear on somebody's best books of 2023, and when the person in my book club suggested this, I was like, great, I've seen that book appear on someone's best books of 2023, so it's going to be amazing. And yeah, I just really didn't get on with it, and I really had to struggle for it, and I had to really like force myself to reach for it. And like I said, like I rarely DNF books because I'm so good at picking books that I like. So when it does happen, it's normally books that I'm reading for a book club, and I really wanted to get myself to read this and like it so I could join in with the book club because I hadn't last month. And yeah, it just didn't work out for me. So sad, but no, that didn't happen. Next book though, a 5-starer and my favourite book from the Women's Prize long list so far, which is also a bit of a shock to me because, well, it's The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. And I started reading this in like October last year, read maybe 20-30 pages and was just like, I am so bored by this, I'm putting this back. Also, I think it might have been a bit of a bad time because it had a 2-week loan on it, which I think never really lends well for a relaxed reading experience for me. But this time I had 3 weeks, which isn't much more, but it definitely made me feel like I had more chance to finish it. And I bloody loved this. This was so, so good. Like, I know Hamnet is very beloved to a lot of people, and I listened to Hamnet and thought it was fine, but this delivered on everything. Like, I really, really loved it. So at the beginning of the book, you're following a girl called Lucrezia, who has just been married into, she's just married a chap called, whose name I've bloody forgotten, Alfonso, and at the beginning you're finding out that she will die in the next 24 hours, and then you go back to her childhood and how her mother and father met, and her and her brother and sisters, and her education, and her being betrothed to this chap Alfonso who's much older than her, and just like, oh my god. And the writing in here was just so perfect, and the sort of, they would just build enough sort of like interest where I'd be like, oh right, okay, so that's how her parents met, that's interesting, and then they had this babies, okay, that's interesting, and then we'd sort of zip forward for like a double page and find out what was happening in these 24 hours leading up to the Lucrezia's death, which was being sort of alluded to being a murder. And when you first meet Alfonso, the chap that she marries, who eventually, like, you believe to poison her, you think, oh, he seems really nice, and he's so nice to her, and he really seems to understand her. And then like little tiny things start happening, and you get a little insight into this, and yeah, it was just unputdownable. This was like historical fiction done at its absolute best. I absolutely loved it. And I finished it and I was like, I could read that again. My sister loved Hamnet. It's a shame this is a library book because I would have just lent it to her instantly. Oh, it's her birthday coming up, so I might buy it for her because I think she'd really, really love it. But yeah, oh my god, thought it was amazing. Really, really loved it, gave it 5 stars. So there we go. Next up was an audiobook, another Women's Prize for Fiction long list book, and that's Fire Rush by Jacqueline Crooks. Now, this was a strange one because I can't be sure the full plot of this. I found this quite difficult to follow, but that being said, I still really enjoyed the audio performance of this. It was narrated by Leonie Scott, who is from Call the Midwife. She plays Lucille on Call the Midwife, played Lucille on Call the Midwife. And the audiobook itself involves sort of like a little bit of music and a little bit of singing. And we're following the main character and her sort of like search, and there's like a few sort of like searchy storylines going on here. So like there's a search for justice because her partner very early on gets killed in a racist attack by the police. There's also sort of like a search for family. She's looking for her mother, and there's sort of like a search for identity and finding out where she fits in with stuff. But yeah, I found it quite difficult to follow, which is unusual for having enjoyed the audiobook so much. So I didn't love it, but there's no part of me that didn't enjoy it. I was just a bit confused about what was going on at some points and stuff like that. But that's not to say that the performance itself wasn't brilliant. So that's how I felt about that one. It was a strange one. I left it feeling a bit like, what? So yeah, a bit strange. Next up was Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh, another book from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. This is a short one. This is a little novella. It's 181 pages, based on a true story actually, and I didn't realise that until at the end. But we're with Elodie, who is the baker's wife in this small village, and somebody called the ambassador has moved to the village with his wife, and Elodie's become quite sort of interested in both the ambassador and his wife, whose name is Violet, and she becomes sort of like a bit obsessed with them, let's say. And she's in quite a I realised when I was reading back through my notes, I wrote that Elodie's in a stale marriage, and I thought, that's pretty funny because she's married to the baker. So I did a little joke there without even realising. So yeah, stale marriage to the baker. And yeah, and she becomes sort of obsessed with these people and what their lives involve, and yeah, and then it all sort of builds up to this one big event that, like I said, ended up being something that really happened in the 50s in France. So yeah, it was intense, and I liked it. I didn't love it. I had another book by Sophie McIntosh called The Water Cure, which apparently is written from the perspective of a group of people, a bit like Virgin Suicides, and I got rid of it. I hung on to it for such a long time, and I thought, I'm never going to get around to it, and now I bloody wish I'd hung on to it, because I would like to read more by this author. So shame, but there we go. And then penultimately, I read A Million to One by Adiba Jaigerda. Speaking of books that you're going through because they are book club books, this was the book club book for Patreon book club this month, and the theme was Irish YA, and I picked this up because I thought the blurb sounded amazing. Let me tell you the blurb and you'll be interested, and then I'll tell you why I didn't like it. So the blurb is that these 4 young women are aboard in the Titanic with plans to pull off a heist. There's a book on the Titanic, which is a book of poetry, and it's embedded with gemstones, and it's called the Rubaiyat, and it's very, very like valuable, and they're planning to steal this book and sell it, and then make lives for themselves off the back of that. Sounds great, doesn't it? And this is all with the backdrop of, we know what happens to the Titanic. Are they gonna manage it? So the countdown, the one thing I will say I did like about this is that each chapter started with whereabouts it was, what was happening, and then a countdown to like an event which you know to be the sinking of the Titanic, or you assume to be the sinking of the Titanic. I assumed right, it was. Every single one of these perspectives from all of the 4 different women, Josepha, Hinna, Violet and Emily, all could be exactly the same. And each of them was brought to this heist for like a specific skill, so like a contortionist or a very good artist or a good mimic and things like that. Well, that all sort of blended into one. I didn't know who was who. None of the perspectives sounded any different to anyone else. And the way it was written was very much like, and then we ran to the post room and we waited there for a bit. And then we picked the lock and we ran here. And then we did this. And then we did that. And it was just so badly done. The writing was so simple. I would have given up on this many, many times. The heist aspect of it, which had drawn me in, was very much based on like being lucky and being in the right place at the right time. And yeah, the whole thing was just very, very flat for me, so I didn't enjoy it. The other book clubbers felt the same. There was a few people who liked it. Nobody loved it. I think the highest score it got was a 3.25. But yeah, again, it lends for a very fun discussion though, if you're all able to sort of like see the holes in a book and chat about it. We had a great time talking about this. So yeah, I didn't enjoy it. I thought it was rubbish, if I'm being honest. But there we go. Sometimes it happens in book club, but the discussion was still great fun. Right, last book then, one I finished yesterday, started yesterday, finished yesterday, read this in a day, Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. Really, really like this. Another Irish book. So because, like I said, I was reading Irish books mixed in with the Women's Prize for Fiction. Well, this is an Irish book on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. Same as The Marriage Portrait. That was an Irish book written by an Irish author on the Women's Prize for Fiction long list. This is fully following Kushla, who is Catholic and lives with her alcoholic mother and works as a teacher in a school in quite a deprived area, and works in her brother's pub as well, and it's set during the time of the Troubles, and she's trying to sort of like help out a family at school with some awful, because there's lots of attacks and awful things going on, and one of the kids in her school their father gets attacked, and she helps out with like nipping him to school and taking groceries and stuff round and things like that. Messages, as I'm told. Well, I lived with an Irish girl for a few years, and when she used to go to the shop, she said, "Can I get any messages for you?" Meaning, can I pick up anything from the shops for you? Absolutely love that. So yeah, and then also she meets a Protestant man whilst working in the pub and begins an affair with him. So yeah, we're following Kushla, and I really liked Kushla a lot. I liked the interaction she had with the other people. I liked seeing this sort of affair develop, and like little passing moments that she'd really hang on to because they really meant something to her, and stuff like that. And also her interactions with the young lad whose dad's been attacked, Davy. Loved him. And yeah, and when I got to the end bit, I'd forgotten that the book starts in 2015 and then nips back to the 90s. And I found the ending really happy. And like, because there are lots of not happy things that go on in this book, but the ending I found really like, oh God, I loved it. It really like settled me. I really thought that's a lovely ending, a perfect ending to this book, and I really loved it. But like I said, again, hell of a lot of trigger warnings in here for sort of violence, and the IRA mentioned a lot, and things that are going on, and but yeah, thought it was really good, really well written, and loved Kushla and loved her interactions. She had a lot going on, and yeah, really enjoyed it. So there we go, the 8 books that I read in the month of March, and 1 DNF. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know how your reading went in the month of March. Would love to hear it. And I'll see you all again tomorrow night. I'll see you tomorrow night for the Cozy Reading Night live show, which starts at 7 PM BST on this here channel. And we're going to be reading together and having a lovely time. And I really can't wait for it. So I'll see you all then. Bye!